From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Mary O'Grady and Bill McGurn. Let's talk about another issue, Mary. We're talking about the legacy of Henry Kissinger, and that is one thing for which the left scores him, which is his alleged support for a coup, it is said, in Chile in the 1970s, in which Salvador Allende had won an election with a plurality of vote, 37%, as you reminded me last night, and then moved sharply left. And, of course, there was a coup. Tell us about the history of that and the real Kissinger role.
The left thought that having gotten Leninist Marxists into the presidency in Chile, all they had to do was, lock things up. And they will never forgive Kissinger for the fact that Chilean Democrats, small d Democrats, wiggled out of that. I mean, they managed to get rid of Salvador Allende. Henry Kissinger understood that the Soviets were in Chile along with the Cubans. They were providing intelligence. Military personnel, Soviet military personnel was providing training. There was a buildup of illegal arms in Chile. And he understood all that, and he saw the danger. And because of that, he backed covert aid to the people who wanted to overthrow Allende, political opponents, and even some private organizations. But Allende really was his own undoing. He destroyed the economy. And the country basically went against him as he tried to drag it to the left. And in the end, there was a coup, but I think it's pretty clear by now because a lot of the classified documents have been released that the U.S. was not involved in that coup. That was something that was led by Augusto Pinochet. And eventually the country returned to democracy, something that cannot be said of Cuba, where the left still celebrates Fidel Castro.
So Kissinger's books I have read with real benefit over the years. He has a distinctive view of foreign policy. He once said to me that his main difference he had with George Shultz in looking at foreign policy was that Shultz tended to look at global affairs through an economic lens, whereas Kissinger himself said he tended to look through the lens of history and culture. And it gave them something of a different framework of looking at world affairs and sometimes gave them differences. I think he also had an abiding focus on world order and stability. It's the theme of one of his books. And in his most recent book on leadership in 2022, vignettes of 6 figures he knew and dealt with in the 20th century, including Nixon, but also including Charles de Gaulle and Margaret Thatcher. And he uses those as portraits for leadership and how to think about strategy as a leader and how to take your country. What do great leaders do? And one of his lines is that great leaders end up taking their country to a place where the public doesn't even know it needs to go, which means seeing ahead and dealing with managing current problems, but also with a vision and direction of where you should go. And one of his abiding concerns is world order. And that plays out now with his concern about China in the U.S., where you have a rising power of China, current dominant power of the U.S. being challenged by China. And Kissinger, sometimes accused of being soft on China, going back to his opening there, strategic opening in the 70s. He very much wants to avoid a war between China and the U.S. now and thinks that we need to develop a relationship that can avoid that, especially in this age of artificial intelligence where and technological development where wars could be catastrophic.
Yeah, I think he was absolutely right. I mean, where he went astray as Secretary of State in his vision, you mentioned the culture. He was also very informed by a Spenglerian kind of view of the West's decline. And so I thought he had to negotiate the best kind of deal he could while the U.S. was in decline or not up to the challenge. And of course, Reagan had more faith, probably because he had more of an economic view in the power of America, American ideals, the American people. And I think that was one of the differences. But about China, he had no illusion. Sure, he was a voice. He wanted, obviously, a stronger military. And I think we would be wise to take it. So many people agree that China is a threat, but they all have bad policies. The Republicans want tariffs and stuff, which are really not going to do anything. And they're just an excuse for not having real policy. And the Democrats are not much better. We could do with a little bit of Kissingerian realpolitik with China. I don't also know, I seem to recall after Tiananmen Square, Kissinger sent the message to the Chinese leaders, hey, you guys really screwed up. You got to do something about it. I know Nixon did, and I think he did too. Again, it all goes back to Henry Kissinger was at his heart an American patriot who appreciated what America meant not only to its citizens, but to the world. So he lived his whole life. One thing that was consistent is believing in America and knowing the world was better when there was an American-led world order.
One final point on Kissinger and the lesson for today, which is we are now debating aid to Ukraine and Israel, two American allies. The lesson of Vietnam is don't pull the plug on an ally. And yet we may end up with the help this time of Republicans, not just a Democratic Congress, pulling the plug on Ukraine with consequences that could be dire for world stability and freedom. Let's turn to the negotiations in the Senate that are taking place over immigration policy. President Biden wants his $106 billion bill, aid for Ukraine, aid for Israel, aid for our allies in the Pacific. Republicans in the Senate, where they have 49 votes and therefore leverage because of the filibuster, are saying we want, in return for voting for that, we want immigration reforms, particularly in asylum, the standard for asylum moving from credible fear, and also in the parole programs for immigrants from places like Venezuela.
Right. They call that parole. And I think the main problem here, I've been listening to this debate over the last week or so, and yesterday in particular, I listened to some of the Senate. The big problem here, I think, is that trust between the Republicans in the Senate and the president completely broken down. I lay a lot of the blame for that at the feet of Alejandro Mayorkas, the head of Homeland Security, because he keeps going back to Washington and telling people that the border is under control. And everybody knows it's not under control. So he can't even admit that there's been a meltdown there. And many of them want to give the aid to Ukraine and Israel. They do not object to that, but they see this immigration fight as the place where they can finally get some leverage on a point they want, which is you have to get control of the border. And it's going to be very hard to get control of the border if you leave the asylum and the parole system the way it is in place, because it acts as a magnet. It draws people, asylum in particular, draws people to the border because they have a very high probability of getting in.
Yeah, Bill, both sides of the debate getting hit from, that is, the negotiators getting hit from the right and the left. In the left, there are the Democrats in the Senate and elsewhere who say any compromise on immigration is unacceptable. And then on the right, some of the House Republicans are saying, well, even these victories on immigration policy are not acceptable because they're not enough. They want much more things with E-Verify and much more restrictive policies.
It's a mess. I mean, you have three parts that are causing problems or splits. You have Democrats want to condition aid to Israel. Republicans, or a lot of Republicans, don't want aid to Ukraine. And then they're split on the border issues. So I noticed that McConnell said he called Biden last week and said, you're going to have to do something real on the border. It won't be everything the Republicans want, especially House Republicans, but he said you have to have something real that I can go back with. At the same time, Chuck Grassley told House Republicans, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You're not going to get everything you want. Just be satisfied and compromise that you get something. So we'll have to see how they come out of it. But there's a lot of forces within the party on both sides of all these issues. And they're going to have to do something quick if they want to get something through.
And the big winner, if this whole effort collapses, would be Vladimir Putin, which nobody in the American government should want to see.